Somewhere in the days of ancient Rome, a doctor looked at a patient who was losing their hair, forgetting things, and slowly going mad, and told them to drink more wine. Not less, but more. And the patient drank it and trusted the advice entirely and got worse. The doctor was not out to kill anyone. He really thought he was helping, and that is the part that should make you a little uncomfortable. We have this comforting notion that ancient humans made fatal errors because they were primitive, uneducated, and didn't know any better. That story is safe because it creates a nice, neat wall between them and us. They're down there, making crazy decisions with their limited understanding, and we're up here, enlightened and rational and way too smart to get caught in the same traps. But when you really look at the specific mistakes that got ancient humans killed, the trend you find has almost nothing to do with intelligence. They were not stupid people. Many were the brightest, most educated, and most respected minds of their time. It wasn't ignorance they shared. Against this, it was much harder to guard. And once you know what that was, the wall between them and us becomes very uncomfortable very quickly. The biggest mistake a person can make is to act upon wrong information. It never questions the information to be wrong in the first place. And that particular failure, the failure to question, appears to be present in almost every ancient catastrophe that might have been averted. Psychologists call it a collective thought when a group of people stop questioning a shared belief. They call it groupthink. Inside a group, it's hard to see group thinking because it doesn't feel like an error. Sounds like consensus. It is as if it is wisdom. It feels like the rational position because everyone else around you thinks it and no one is challenging it. The very thing that should make you skeptical, universal agreement, is the thing that shuts your skepticism down completely. Ancient civilizations were run by authority. If the doctor said it, the priest confirmed it, and the ruler endorsed it, then not only did the idea seem true, it seemed dangerous to question. Doubt was not only socially embarrassing, in many cultures it was even a crime. So people stopped doubting aloud and then stopped doubting in private. It wasn't ignorance that came later. It was something far more psychologically complex and far harder to escape, a system in which wrong answers were protected and right questions unthinkable. The Roman elite were slowly poisoning themselves for about 500 years and had the slightest clue it was happening. Lead was ubiquitous in Roman life. It coated their water pipes, it coated their cooking vessels, and it was used to sweeten wine through a syrup called sapa, which was made by boiling grape juice in lead pots. The resulting sweetener was delicious, rich, and had enough lead per serving to cause serious neurological damage if taken regularly. Roman doctors noticed that some symptoms regularly appeared in the rich: memory loss, irritability, joint pain, a creeping mental deterioration that only got worse with time. But since lead was so deeply embedded in Roman life, and its use was linked to luxury and sophistication, nobody made the connection. The poison wasn't invisible because it was hidden, but because it was everywhere, and things that are everywhere stop being things people think to question. What makes this especially disturbing is that some ancient writers did raise fears about lead. The warnings were there. They were simply ignored because the system, the infrastructure, the economy, and the cultural habits built around lead use were too big, too comfortable to dismantle over something as abstract as a suspicion. It wasn't stupidity. It was that classic human trait of holding on to what you know even when the evidence against it is quietly piling up right in front of you. In ancient Egypt, one common treatment for infected wounds was to smear a paste of animal dung on the injury itself. There was a logic. It wasn't random. Dung was warm. It was organic, and in a world before microscopes and germ theory, warmth and organic stuff were reasonable stand-ins for healing power. The logic was consistent with the knowledge of the time. The results were devastating. Many of the patients who survived their original injury died of infections introduced by the treatment itself. But this is the psychologically important part. These treatments were used for centuries, even as patients continued to die, and it's not stupidity that kept them going. If a patient died, it was never that the treatment was wrong. Either the disease was too far gone, or the gods were displeased, or the constitution of the patient was too weak. The treatment was always shielded from blame by a layer of alternative explanations that made failure invisible. This is a pattern that is found in practically every ancient medical tradition. The cure was holy, the physician was the authority, and death was redefined as anything but a sign that the method itself was wrong. It's not as if the doctors of old didn't care that people died. The system was killing them, because it was almost psychologically impossible for anyone inside the system to look directly at what the system was doing wrong. Trepanation is one of the oldest surgical procedures ever recorded. That means drilling or scraping a hole directly into a living person's skull. What is really strange about it is not that it was done under dire emergency situations. It is that it was done routinely, in dozens of totally disconnected ancient cultures, on patients who walked in voluntarily. trusting the person holding the drill completely. Many trepanation patients are known from the archaeological record to have survived the procedure. The regrowth of bone around the holes confirms this, which means ancient surgeons had learned enough to open a human skull without killing the patient at once. That part is really impressive. What they thought they were doing is less impressive. In most ancient cultures, trepanation was practiced to free evil spirits, relieve pressure from divine punishment, or to create a hole through which spiritual energy could flow more freely. Sometimes the process worked by chance, when there was dangerous pressure building up inside the skull. But it was done much more broadly than those cases warranted, in patients with headaches, behavioral changes, or symptoms that had nothing to do with skull pressure at all. The authority which was exercised was absolute, and the belief system which sustained it was total. People submitted. To refuse treatment from such a powerful man was more than just a social faux pas. In many cultures, it was interpreted as proof that the patient deserved what was happening to them. In 53 BC, a Roman general named Crassus led an army of about 35,000 soldiers into the Parthian desert, despite repeated warnings from people who knew the terrain that the strategy was suicidal. His scouts reported. His friends said the geography was telling him. Flat open land with no cover, no reliable water, and an enemy famous for mobile mounted archery that made traditional Roman formation fighting almost useless. He kept on walking. At Carrhae, nearly 20,000 Romans died, and another 10,000 were taken prisoner. It remains one of the most catastrophic military defeats in the history of Rome. What is psychologically interesting about Crassus is that he was not incompetent by the standards of his time. He was rich, politically powerful, and had real military experience. What he had in dangerous excess was pride, the kind of pride that makes incoming information feel like a personal attack instead of useful data. Every warning passed through a mind that had already made up its mind. Every warning turned into something to be ignored, rather than something to be heeded. This pattern is repeated in the ancient military history with almost mechanical regularity. Armies marching into known traps, because retreat was a shame. Generals who dismissed intelligence because to accept it was to admit ignorance. Campaigns that were doomed, not because the enemy was stronger, but because pride had made the leadership functionally blind to information that could have saved thousands of lives. So think about everything that we just went through. Romans poisoning themselves with lead for 5 centuries when the evidence was there for all to see. Doctors that used therapies that killed more people than the diseases they were meant to cure. Surgeons drilling into living skulls on the basis of belief systems, which no one within the culture was allowed to question. Generals who led whole armies to certain death because pride had made honest thought a weakness. None of them were stupid people. That's the point. They were educated, respected, often brilliant people who worked in systems where asking certain questions was socially dangerous, spiritually forbidden, or psychologically unbearable. They weren't random mistakes. They had a tendency. The wrong answers were protected by authority. Culture had made the right questions seem dangerous, and often the last people to be given the opportunity to name the problem were those closest to it. What makes this more than just an interesting history lesson is what happens when you flip that pattern and point it at the present. They are not ancient problems, but for the conditions that produced these ancient disasters. Unquestioned authority, groupthink, pride that filters out inconvenient information, and systems that protect themselves from honest scrutiny. These are human problems, and human troubles tend to travel very well in time. The most dangerous mistake you can make is to get the wrong answer. It's being in a system where the right question is unthinkable, and never realizing that you are doing precisely that. This pattern is repeated elsewhere, and it's much closer to your everyday life than ancient Rome, and it's a lot harder to see from the inside.